Good evening and welcome to the October 2022 meeting of the Linnean Society. I am Rochelle Thomas, the current president, and as such, will call the meeting to order. While we are still holding lectures on Zoom, I was happy to see so many Linnean members and friends in person at our homecoming picnic on September 18th. It's an absolute pleasure to see our community keep growing. If you aren't officially part of our community, please consider joining us tonight. And for members who are watching but still need to pay their annual dues, please note that you can do so online or via mail. And join us on an upcoming field trip. We are going places every week and weekend. There's surely a destination that's just right for you. Based on what we think was a resounding success last month, we've returned to broadcasting live from my apartment. Apparently, my humble abode, much like the barn cheers, is conveniently the closest watering hole on the way home from work for both our speaker, Annie Novak, and our Vice President, Gabriel. On to logistics. As always, we've disabled the chat feature, so if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box. Our Vice President, Gabriel Willow, who has hopefully returned to Earth after discovering a sulfur-bellied flycatcher at Wave Hill over the weekend, will answer your questions at the conclusion of the lecture and will also adjourn the meeting. On to business. Thank you to everyone who submitted votes on the items listed in last week's President's Letter. Motion number 1, to accept the following members of the Linnean Society passed with 144 in favor and 1 opposed. New members and sponsors are Christophe Illuminating, sponsored by Kristen Ellington, Charles Tang, sponsored by Mary Beth Cooper, Sheila Epstein, sponsored by Chuck McAlexander, Richard Madonna, sponsored by Paul Sweet, Valerie Hartman, sponsored by Kristen Ellington, Leslie Morel Fisk, sponsored by Mary Beth Cooper, Julie Floyd, sponsored by Elise Bozier, C. Peter Davenport, sponsored by Junko Suzuki, Nora Benolio, sponsored by Sylvia Alexander, and Lila Burke, sponsored by Janet Wooten. Welcome to our newly elected members. Motion number 2, to accept September 2022 meeting minutes, passed unanimously with 145 in favor and 0 opposed. However, we did have 2 members write to us with emendations, so we have updated the final copy with those suggestions. And now, I have the honor of introducing Annie Novak. Annie Novak is an urban farmer, author, and activist. Annie is the founder and director of Growing Chefs, a field to fork food education program, the manager of the Edible Academy at New York Botanical Garden, co-founder and farmer of the nation's first commercial green roof farm, Eagle Street Rooftop in Brooklyn, and is the author and illustrator of the Rooftop Growing Guide, How to Transform Your Roof into a Garden or Farm. For her efforts to green the city landscape, Annie was recognized by the Audubon Society's Women in Conservation program. Annie writes for Living Bird and Bird Conservation, among other publications, and lectures on the history of and the technology used to study nocturnal bird migration over the changing North American landscape. Annie has served on the board of the American Bird Conservancy since 2018. Tonight, just a few feet away from where I'm sitting, Annie will present 1001 Nights, Illuminating Nocturnal Bird Migration. Over to you, Annie.
Hi, thank you so much. Rochelle, you can let me know that you can hear me. I hear myself, so I think we're good.
Yeah, we're good.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. It's been a long time coming. And Rochelle, thank you for hosting, and Gabriel, thank you so much for coordinating my presence at this meeting. Before I jump into my slides about nocturnal bird migration, I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge the Lenape people from whose land I join you, under a sky once blanketed in passenger pigeons, and the living birds whose lovely presence connects us to their ancestors, and the plants and animals that once covered this tremendous land. I love New York City deeply and forever. And I know that many of you probably feel the same way, whether or not you would express it so passionately. And I'm grateful to all of you, both as people who care about New York and birds, as well as those of you that serve as advocates for them, which I think we all do, by being present at a lecture like this one. So I'm going to switch to my slides, and I just want to acknowledge that I have notes on a screen over here. So if I break eye contact, that's why, but hopefully you'll be looking at the pictures and not so much at my face. Because my friends, if I didn't have notes, this talk would go on till midnight. Rochelle, would you be so kind as to enable participant screen sharing for me?
Yes. 1.
Thank you.
More? Nope.
This is why we bring Vice President Gabriel Willow in early.
Click that carrot. We didn't think of this, huh?
Yeah, I thought we did.
Oh. Copy invite link. Caption meeting. Wait. Panelists 2. more. It would be this. Make
And as we work
more
through this
difference.
technical difficulty,
We're
I would
making
also
you
like
the
to acknowledge
co-host.
that Gabriel found the best bird of the year.
Okay, try now, Annie.
Yes, that should work. Thank you. If you could just let me know that you are now seeing a slide on screen that says 1001 Nights.
We see it.
Fantastic. Okay, so you are now in my imagination with me. On any given day, up to 400 billion individual birds may be found soaring, swimming, hopping, and flying on this wonderful planet. Now, not all birds migrate, but more than 3/4 of North American and about 1/3 of the world's bird species are migratory, and some are part of their ranges. I'll just get this out of the way and say that food seems to be the driving factor. More birds migrate in environments with clear seasons and seasonality. Birds are usually absent from breeding habitat when food sources are as well. And climate, the arrival of cold weather, for example, and competition for territory are also factors in migration, but food is the dominant and often overlapping force with those factors. Now, we are diurnal, Homo sapiens as a species. And so we're used to the seasonal movement of birds that migrate during the daytime. You probably are all seeing right now skeins of Canada geese, the V formations they make, or huge lines of double-crested cormorants moving. Pelicans, hummingbirds, swifts and swallows, hawks and falcons, all of these migrate during the daytime. Another world exists in the night sky. Most migratory land birds, like songbirds and shorebirds, take to the air after sunset and remain aloft until dawn. Our atmosphere at night is cooler and smoother, making flight easier and less calorically intense. Darkness also provides protection from predation. Depending on the species and their ability, nocturnally migrating birds can use the moon, stars, as well as the glow of sunrise and sunset, and the magnetic poles for some species to help orient themselves. New York City is a really incredible place to study migration. I count my blessings every day that this interest of mine happened to happen while I live here. New York City has over, of the 981 birds, close to 1,000 birds that live in North America at large, 476 pass through the East Coast. And of this, 386 are visitors or residents of New York City, which is about 40% of the entire North American population. So even if you're not a birder now, you have a very strong chance of being a successful one just by living here. Within the 5 boroughs, New York City has over 20,000 acres of natural landscape. It's not the first thing tourists think of, but it's one of the most beautiful aspects of living in New York. We have grasslands, meadows, freshwaters and saltwater wetlands, ocean and riverfront, and 7,000 acres of forest, including 50 acres at the New York Botanical Garden of old growth forest, true forest that has lived there for centuries. This diversity supports birds. Some of my favorites are here. Balding grassland bird that passes between here and Argentina. Cedar wax, which is beautifully hand painted. The females making nests in a short week, taking about 2 trips to gather nest materials in 5 days. Baltimore orioles, which are my spark bird. United States, a sure pendulum that swings back and forth between our spring and our winter. And before I move past this slide, I have to play you the bubbling song if you're not familiar. To know these birds is to love them. What other animal could sound so precisely like R2D2? To meet these birds as species, for example, song sparrows generally, as well as individuals like the song sparrow that returns to my yard every year, also engenders curiosity. Where do they go as a season cycle? What is their experience of the world like? In the boundary layer between the earth and the atmosphere, what is their life like and how is that different than mine? To explore this story, we start in the dark. The science of understanding nocturnal bird migration is very nascent, and that makes it very exciting for me to tag along. Most of what I'm going to share with you tonight is very new science, like a generation or two old. It's constantly evolving. The study of aeroecology, or the ecosystem of life in the sky, was only given that name in 2017. A similar journey by one of my greatest heroes began in the middle of the 20th century. In 1951, Rachel Carson, a very reluctant public speaker and not yet famous nor author of Silent Spring, which she published in the 1960s, closed a characteristically brief talk with, I'm sure, great charisma by playing a hydrophone recording of shrimp, whales, and other animals made at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. For many in the room, it was their first time hearing the sounds of life under the sea. Carson was a marine biologist by training, and she loved and recognized the water around us as a complex and beautiful place. Now, others could hear it and see it too for the first time because of this new mid-century technology enabling underwater photography and sound recordings at depths historically considered cold, dark, and empty. For centuries, if not millennia, that was our understanding of the ocean. For many in the room that day, it was their first time not only hearing the sounds of whales and life under the water, but also clicking and recognizing that the ocean was not dead, but vast and dynamic and vital as an ecosystem. At the time, Carson wrote, "Only a century ago, men thought nothing could live in the deep waters of the ocean. They believed that, at most, there could only be a few sparks of life in the black waters of the ocean abyss. Now, of course, we know better." The sky has long been seen as empty of life as well. Nothing could be further from the truth. The black waters of the night sky opened up to me for the first time at something called the Tribute in Light. Since 2002, every year on the anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attack on Lower Manhattan, two enormously powerful beams of light blaze up into the night sky, the Tribute in Light. Even in a city of skyscrapers, the Tribute is colossal. Twin columns of blue-white light shining 4 miles high into the bruised orange-black bowl of the night sky. With clear weather in New York City, these beams are crisply visible from over 60 miles away. The lights are a beacon in more ways than one. They mean a lot to New Yorkers, and birds are also drawn to the beams by the thousands, which provides a unique opportunity to study and understand nocturnal bird migration and the powerful impact that light pollution has on their movement. The beams are organized into two sets of 44 lights each, arranged in these two arrays, forming echoes of the twin towers that fell during the terrorist attacks. Throughout the night, technicians tend to the beams, checking cables and brushing insects as they fall to the glass lenses and begin to burn. The effect of artificial light at night on birds is pretty well documented, if still being understood. I've found historical evidence dating back centuries to how lighthouses have impacted nocturnal bird migration. From lighthouse keepers 2 centuries ago to monitors of the Tribute in Light in New York City today, observers note that under the influence of light, birds lower and slow in their flight path, most frequently on nights with overcast skies. Entrained in the beams, they risk exhaustion or collision with structures. Additionally, at a regional scale, sky glow can draw birds towards the urban landscape, which brings them away from green spaces crucial during migration for food and shelter. Species to species strategies differ. Tanagers, vireos, flycatchers, thrushes, warblers, orioles, all of these different species have different ways they like to move. Many migrate not in flocks, but singly. So particularly for those of us used to seeing movements of Canada geese, I mentioned double-crested cormorants, the idea that birds can migrate alone is pretty different than we usually conceptualize migration. Some songbirds like to check in with each other from a few hundred feet apart using short, species-specific calls. A good night for warblers, for example, if you're down in Cape May, listening on a low cloud cover night can sound a little bit like a game of Marco Polo. But at the Tribute in Light, what it sounds like is a traffic jam. The pictures on the right here are visual illustrations of what these different chip calls or flight calls sound like. On the top left is northern water thrush. In the very middle is the ovenbird. On the top right is black-throated blue warbler. The bottom left is common yellowthroat, and the bottom right is American redstart. And if this illustration in particular intrigues you, oldbird.org is a great resource. I should mention too as well that as I go through these slides, there are a few moments where there are QR codes. If you have your phone handy and you open up the camera, you can scan those QR codes and it will take you to websites that talk more about what I'm talking about. And at the end, I'll share a book list with you as well. Insects are also attracted to the beams. As I mentioned, this is a big part of the light technician's job, is to make sure that they can sweep the insects off the lights as they land so that they don't damage the glass. One of the nights that I was up there, a student from Cornell University collected katydids, ladybugs, praying mantises, water beetles, fiery skippers, moths, leafhoppers, lacewings, ground beetles, and even some honeybees, among hundreds of other species. Most of these samples are collected after the insects have already hit the lights and burn, or as they fall exhausted after circling. Similar to the birds, they become entrained by the beams. In coordination with the National September 11th Memorial and Museum, New York City Audubon takes a major diplomatic lead in an annual presence monitoring the tribute to ensure that the beauty of the memorial does not interfere with the safe passage of nocturnally migrating birds. In 2007, New York City Audubon proposed the following official protocol, and I hope this sets your mind at ease if you're worried about this as an event that hurts birds. Now, if one or more birds crashes to the ground dead, or if the birds appear to be trapped, circling and flying in the beams and calling, or if 1,000 birds are in the beams for more than a 20-minute period, then the lights are shut off also for 20 minutes, allowing them to fly on. The tribute captures in a nutshell much of the science and mystery of nocturnal bird migration in present day, and we'll return to that. But our second tale takes us from the misconception of bird migration or misconceptions around bird migration to hard evidence and our historic understanding of where birds are going and how they get there. So we're pretty lucky, I have to say, where we're at in a lot of our scientific understanding. We were all born into a world that understands the planet as a sphere. I hope we all agree on that, and that birds move across its surface fairly freely. This was not the case even, for example, for my grandmother. The information that I have about migration is very much more sophisticated than what she grew up learning. Similarly, and perhaps a lot worse, for most of human history, while the appearance and disappearance and reemergence of birds was observed, the phenology of that was really well observed, where they went and how they did it was not very well understood. Popular European theories of a few centuries ago included ideas like birds transfigmongered, turning from one species into another as spring became summer, became fall, became winter. This particular illustration is based on a 16th century woodblock from a book called History and Nature of Northern Peoples by a Swedish archbishop who was absolutely wrong about swallows hibernating over the winter in lakes. I will say again, that is not correct. What was inarguable to any reasonable observer throughout history is that something was happening. Not just the birds disappearing and reappearing, but the behavior of the birds as individuals and as species changed dramatically with the seasons if they were migratory. For example, they stocked up on food. They changed out their feathers. And they exhibited a particularly intriguing behavior called Zugunru, which is illustrated here in a wonderful scientific experiment conducted in the 1960s. This is, I think, best described as birds sort of psyching themselves up for directional movement. In this experiment, an ink pad is placed at the bottom of a funnel. And as a bird lands on it, its feet become blue, or whatever color the ink is. And then it flies up and strikes at the side of the funnel with its feet, leaving a series of stamp marks. And what scientists observed, both behaviorally centuries ago and in this experiment in the 1960s, is that during certain periods of the year, all of the movement was very acutely directional, which is to say that for most of the year, birds would just sort of try and escape the funnel, and you would see ink pad marks all over the inside of it. But for those periods of the year in which birds were meant to migrate, all of the marks, all of the footprints would be in one spot, in one area, because the bird was trying to orient in one particular direction. Now, making maps of where birds moved in the world, knowing where a particular species was during different points of the year, was for a very long time very vague. For example, one map might be, here's a bird and now it's hibernating in the mud, which we now know is not true. A lot of how we started to piece together these maps historically was through something called faunal accounts, which is a sort of a diary or phenology record of which species migrate and how far they go, usually derived from accounts taken by folks exploring those geographical spaces. Also specimen collections. So if, for example, if someone went out on an expedition or went exploring their country, their region, another continent, they might bring back skins or, the skins of birds. And from that, be able to say, okay, I collected a skin from North Africa that matches a skin that I found here in Europe, and might be able to piece a map together from that. One of the most foundational pieces of evidence particularly for transcontinental bird migration happened in 1822 when two men were walking across a property in northern Germany in a town on the Baltic Sea. And they saw a white stork, pictured here on the left, fly overhead with a really weird protuberance sticking out of its neck, also pictured here. They acted very much like folks in the 1820s might have, and they shot it down. And what they found was that this was a 2.5 foot long spear. And this bird, the Rostock arrow stork, and its spear are now taxidermed at the University of Rostock in the care of Dr. Anders Bleek. A seaworm expert, Dr. Bleek is responsible for this bizarre cabinet of curiosities that the university's collection hosts, from the creatures of his expertise, seaworms, to thousands of butterfly samples, beautiful drawer after drawer, which he bleakly told me no one looks at. After the white stork was shot down in 1822, a flurry of correspondence between Europeans living in Europe, as well as in various colonized African countries, identified the spear as similar to those made in Chad, which is in Central Africa. This provided physical proof of an individual white stork moving between two places, a tremendous difference of over 4,000 kilometers. Around the same time, across the ocean, John James Audubon was tying silver threads around the ankles of eastern phoebes that nested in the riverbank cliffs close to his house to see if the same individuals returned to the site within each new season. But that's our next story. And before I tell it, I want to mention something else about the 19th century, a quiet rumble that became a roar in the changing landscape of bird migration. In addition to increasing urbanization, quickly advancing agriculturalization of most of North America's land, and the epic, disturbing mass murdering of birds for sport, food, and fashion that the 1800s and 1900s brought, we also introduced electricity. If our story is primarily told in the dark, it is this chapter that most profoundly influences the nocturnal landscape. At the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, pictured here with the beautiful Field Museum in the background, on the first day of May, peak migration season in a peak migration space right on the shores of Lake Michigan, President Grover Cleveland pushed a button and lit in a single stroke 100,000 incandescent lamps to demonstrate, as well as compete with London, that Chicago could take on the wobbly new technology of electric lights soon available to everyone everywhere. For many visitors to this World's Fair and to all of the birds that flew overhead, it was their very first time seeing the power of a spotlight's beam, as well as the power of 100,000 incandescent lamps. It was the first time moving through a nocturnal landscape without the help of a flame from a lamp or a star. This was the beginning of the end of the night sky. And I'll return to this as well. So in the 20th and 21st century, our understanding of bird migration has deeply accelerated. Now, rather than shooting down birds to check for spears, we have multiple modalities to follow their paths across the planet. Bird banding, geo-tracking, Christmas bird counts, and other community science programs have helped us make better maps of their worlds. There is nothing, like absolutely nothing, like having a wild bird in your hand. Birds are stronger, lighter, and more personality rich than you could possibly imagine. They're funny, they're intelligent, they're fierce, and they're stunning. And they are nothing like people, which at the end of the day is one of my favorite things about experiencing them up close. You can't take your experience of the world and assume a bird has the same one. And I think being able to touch that and see that and really explore that makes it much more interesting to be a person. Bird banding is principally practiced for data collection. My experience working with bird banders through this project, themselves also funny and intelligent, hardworking, and often very lovably kooky, is perhaps my favorite part of this project. As practiced now, bird banding is a 4-part process. Birds are caught in mist nets, banded and measured. Birds are then released and the information is entered into a database. These mist nets are typically 12 meters long and about 2.5 meters high, and they'll be strung throughout different areas of shrubs or other spaces where they'll remain invisible to birds, where the birds might land during morning flight or as they hop around a territory for a certain period of time. Aluminum bands are sized to the species and placed around their wrists, basically. Data collected might include the band number, the date, the time of day, age, sex, something called the wing chord, which is the distance from the wrists to the end of the primary feather, longest primary wing feather. Often they'll collect mass or weight, the fat condition, to learn a little bit more about how well prepared the birds are for migration, and their molt, or what their feathers are up to. Some banders will also measure things like tail length, wingspan, something called the hallux, which is the big toenail on a bird, and the culmen length, or the beak length. Bird banding stations are located all over the world in targeted migration hotspots, places like Cape May, where I hope you all have been, in New Jersey. Eilat, Israel, or Falsterbo, Sweden are some of the hotspots that I've had a chance to visit, and truly some of the most amazing places to see migration in action in the world. In the case of Falsterbo, which is pictured here in Sweden, they can serve a dual purpose. So there's a bird banding station. Some of the action is shown there on the left. But Falsterbo also hosts a weather station and a lighthouse. And at this weather station, every few hours, day or night, weather data, wind, precipitation, etc., is recorded by hand by the couple who live on the site. This dedication to data is very characteristic of bird banding stations. That being said, only about 3% of banded birds are ever recovered. So we've developed more tools to accurately study bird movement. One of these that is so freaking rad is solar-powered GPS, GSM transmitters, which use cellular networks to record locations in 3 dimensions, latitude, longitude, and altitude, at programmable intervals, say every 30 seconds. Placed on a bird, they're very small, super innocuous, they don't hurt anybody. They can give extraordinary accurate recordings of their movements, which can help us understand their behavior, their response to weather and climate changes, etc., without ever having the bird in hand or disturbing it beyond the gentle application of the device. The data can be kind of funny, though, and I show this as an example of that. Forgive me, it's very serious stuff. It's super cool that we're doing it, but this particular example always makes me giggle. This is Scott Weidensaul, who you all may know as naturalist. He is a tremendous author, and he's also a fellow who runs something called Project Snowstorm, which you can scan the QR code if you want to learn more. And he had affixed one of these tracking devices to the back of a snowy owl, and the data that came forth looked like this, which is very confusing because this is not a normal migration pattern of a snowy owl. It was also very slow moving, which confused the folks at Project Snowstorm, like why this erratic movement and why so slow? And come to pass, what they found out when they went and observed the owl, I believe in person is how they figured this out, is that they weren't tracking the owl as much as they were tracking an owl sitting on an ice floe. And so they didn't really learn that much about owl migration, but they learned an awful lot about the movement of ice. Perhaps the most powerful tool of all, and this is why I get so excited to be studying this right now, for our understanding of the night sky, as well as for conservation purposes, is the use of radar. Radar, or radio detection and ranging, is the use of radio waves to pick up and image the location and speed of objects. It was developed in the 1940s as a tool of war. Early radar operators, though, quickly picked up on mysterious echoes that were neither airplanes, which is what they were looking for, or weather. They used to call these angels. Now they're known as AP, or anomalous propagation. Quickly, because I'm sure birders, once they heard something was happening in the sky, jumped right on this technology. Ornithologists, the British ornithologist David Lack was among the first, started to watch radar as a tool to look for the arrival and departure of migrating birds. In Dr. Lack's case, it was in the British Isles. Now there are at least 4 types of radar, and you can use all of them to study bird movement, although we're going to focus on this WSR-88D radar. There's airport surveillance radar, or ASR. There's weather surveillance radar, WSR, tracking radar, and marine surveillance radar. Radar relies on microwaves reflected off of an object from a microwave transmitter. And what the radar sees is any material that's radar reflective within that object or body. So in aircraft, metal reflects these microwaves. In birds and even insects, water acts as a reflector. So even something like pollen can show up on radar. The difference among the different radar systems I just mentioned is basically power and beam shape. You didn't come to this lecture to learn this much about radar, but just so you understand how this works, marine and airport surveillance radars use a fan-shaped beam that's about 23 degrees in height and only 2 degrees in horizontal width. Weather and tracking radars use a conical beam, which is what's shown here on the left, of only about a degree to a degree. Airport and marine radar do not measure altitude, which is kind of confusing because at an airport you think altitude would be important, but in fact, air traffic controllers use transponders to figure that out. What is truly incredible about this technology is that there is a powerful list of questions that radar can answer. What time of day do birds migrate? So if you're watching radar, and I'm going to show you an image in a second that illuminates how this shows up, you can see in a live stream of radar, these populations appear. How many hours of the day or the night are they flying? You can just watch the radar bloom and watch that bloom disappear. Do migrants stop moving when it rains or during high winds or when the wind changes directions? How fast are birds flying? How high? In what direction? How many migrants are aloft? Are they moving in flocks? So again, these are all questions that observers have been trying to do from the ground for decades, if not centuries, if not millennia. But radar is able to illustrate that very clearly. What radar can't do, though, is identify what's being tracked, sort of. There's some tools that can take, for example, data from eBird, which is a citizen science community science data collection tool, and correlate that with some radar material. It can also sometimes take the speed at which birds are moving and with a little bit of guesswork, figure out what species you're looking at. But generally speaking, and you'll see with this illustration, it's just a blob of color. So it's not telling you necessarily what species you're looking at. Radar is also only effective in a small area. North America has great radar, but if you travel to other parts of the world, you won't necessarily have these towers built to pick up birds. What I will say, though, is in North America, radar has confirmed what I think was long suspected as some pronounced migratory pathways. So for example, the Atlantic coastline, the Mississippi River, the Rocky Mountains, and the Pacific coastline as well. So here's an actual image that I collected a couple of years ago in the fall, just screenshotting radar.weather.gov, which you can visit using that QR code. And what you're looking at here, for one, is, like I said, this really cool, extensive coverage that the United States has. We are very lucky that we have radar stations all over our country. The green, you might notice, is familiar to you from watching the news and the weather. That is a storm system. The blooms that you see of green and blue, those are in fact birds. So if you remember in that last illustration, that conical shape, that cone shape of the radar beams, part of why these appear as in motion as sort of donuts is because birds are lifting off the ground and getting collected in that rotating, or getting picked up in that rotating cone. So the bottom, as birds first come off the ground, creates a smaller circle, and then the higher they move in the sky, the wider the beam of radar is and the more birds that it's catching. So not to make this overly confusing, but the small dots on the left versus the larger blue blooms on the right doesn't necessarily mean smaller amounts versus larger amounts of birds. It just means that the birds in the west are lower than the birds on the right in the east, which makes sense if you think about our time zones. If birds are taking off for migration flight at night around 10 p.m. on the East Coast, or most likely closer to 11:30 or midnight on the East Coast, on the right here shows a huge movement of birds, whereas out west, it's 2-3 hours behind. So birds are just getting off the ground. Another thing I'd point out, and this picture on the left here, that's from an app called Dark Sky, which is my favorite weather app. This shows wind direction and speed. This, I can tell, is an image from the fall because birds typically use these southerly winds to move from their breeding grounds in the north down back to the south. And that favorable wind, this is like a really great wind system for birds to migrate south, is part of why you're seeing such big blue blossoms of birds in movement. Now, a lot of this information has been aggregated and displayed really beautifully in something called Birdcast, which is a research program out of Cornell. So I'm showing you sort of the analog version that I learned when I was getting interested in this back in 2017, 2018, but we've moved past this for sure. And this all comes to a head back at the Tribune and Light. So circling back on that, this is a paper that came out of years and years and years of Cornell Lab of Ornithology and New York City Audubon having a presence at the Tribune and Light. What you're seeing here is a combination of data sets. On the right is a few pieces of information about the number of birds appearing in the beams, the flight speed at which they're moving, and the vocal activity. And I won't go into too much detail, but you should definitely read the paper. There'll be a link on the next slide. But what you'll notice is that when the beams are on, shown in green, versus when they're off, shown in gray, there's a huge jump in the number of flight calls, for example, when the beams are on. And there's also a big jump in that top box of birds in the beams when the lights are on and dissipating after the lights are turned off. So those particular graphs are fairly straightforward. It is obvious that turning the lights off really helps the birds move away from that space. And also it quiets them down because they're less panicked as they're trapped in the beams. But what I want to focus on here is the use of radar. I'll give you a minute to kind of orient yourself to this image. And also, if you'd like to, again, you can pull up the exact research paper here. But the key thing to notice is that when the beams are on, there's a fiery red spot that shows up in the radar. And that is an indication that birds are aggregating towards the beams. So in tonight's lecture, I very briefly mentioned at the top of the talk that birds help orient themselves during nocturnal bird migration by using light. Sunset, sunrise are really important factors towards getting birds to move in a certain direction. It helps them orient. Artificial light at night, or ALAN, or city sky glow, is really disturbing for birds. It draws them into habitat towards urban areas, as I mentioned, that isn't necessarily the habitat they should be in. So what this paper very specifically pinned was that if you have a huge light installation, again, visible from 40 miles away, it profoundly draws birds towards that location. And when you cessate the lights or shut them off, the birds are very quickly able to disperse. This is not unique to the Tribune and Light. This is a story of all urban light pollution and all light pollution generally. I should mention as well with radar, before we circle back on light, that the use of radar impacts all of our understanding of aeroecology. As I mentioned before, radar picks up on insects, it picks up on pollen. Some of these insects are migrating, like aphids, dragonflies, spiders. These are all have species that migrate. Some of them are insects that spend a majority of their life in the air, like fish in the sea. This data can help inform farmers when to spray or not to spray their crops. It can help inform wind turbine operators when they might want to turn off the wind turbines to cause the least damage to animals moving through the airspace, and so much more. So now, with all of these tools, with our bird banding, with the use of eBird, with Christmas bird counts, with radar, now that we have a better understanding of where birds are moving, why and how, where they end up, when they take off, when they come back, where is home? What are they coming home to? Well, it's changed a lot over the last century and a half. As I've mentioned, we have filled the night sky with photons. More than 80% of the world and all but 1% of North Americans and Europeans sleep under extremely light polluted skies. Most North Americans, all of us in New York included, are no longer able to easily see the Milky Way. To me, this is pretty dramatic. This is an abrupt rupture from most of the human experience on Earth. Global light pollution is increasing at a rate of 2% annually. This map set shows a progression of light pollution from the 1950s, top left, to 1970s, top right, to 1990, bottom left, and a projection from 3 years from now, or 2025. This has a really profound impact on nocturnally migrating birds. And if you scan this QR code or get the book list later, this is a really impactful paper that came out recently about the regional effect of light pollution on migrating birds. Once sky glow draws them in, their experience of our buildings come daytime is very problematic. In the United States alone, up to 1 billion birds a year die from striking glass windows. I'm going to quote one of my favorite people, Chris Shepard, who works with the American Bird Conservancy, when she was explaining to me what a bird's experience of glass is. And she says, when we're born as humans, we don't see glass. We have to learn to see glass. A bird flying into glass may concuss, snap their spine, or break their foot, wing, or beak. Stunned, they'll fly off and die elsewhere. The dead are not always found. Scavengers like cats, rats, and raccoons are known to check problematic windows for packages. To understand why and how poorly managed light and structures can be deadly for birds, I want you to just start by getting rid of the phrase bird's eye view. It's a very misleading phrase. When you're flying in an airplane and you look down, or when you use Google Maps, that is not a bird's eye view at all. That's not how birds see the world. All animals share the same planet, but from a sensory perspective, we live in extraordinarily different worlds, and human beings in particular from most living creatures on Earth. If the largest by mass group of species are insects, we could not be more different. For human sight, the best resolution and color lie directly ahead. This is neither the monopoly on reality for most species, nor is it a baseline from which most species deviate their experience. Our perception of the world is very different from individual birds, and bird species also see the world very differently from one another. I would encourage you to think about the life of a penguin, the life of a hawk, the life of a goldfinch. These are not animals that live in the same spaces, and they see and perceive the world differently from all sensory angles, taste, smell, etc. So Chris Shepard, continuing her genius again, she told me, birds process the world much more as how they're immersed in it. We tend to see the world as something we are moving into directly ahead of us, but birds are immersed. They're looking for predators behind them. In this picture, you can see a comparison between human and a white stork's view of the world. The green represents the frontal vision and the blue represents peripheral vision. So we prioritize frontal vision because our eyes are in the front of our head. Birds prioritize and experience the world primarily through peripheral vision. The only slightly self-indulgent thing I'll mention about this is that as a person who's trying to illustrate a book about birds and a bird's experience of the world, it is very hard to draw a bird's horizon line. It is very hard to draw a world in which peripheral vision is the dominant viewpoint. And you will not see any of those illustrations tonight because I haven't figured it out. Now, with all this doom and gloom, I'll mention that thankfully over the last few decades, many North American cities have adopted lights out practices, darkening their skylines during peak migration periods to protect the biology and local ecology of their insects and animals. Paul Curlinger, who's another author I stan, writes that none of us want the bird population to be reduced to those who can most easily get along with us, such as the robin, roadrunner, mallard, and crow. And indeed, our capacity to change our city landscape and to think more thoughtfully about how birds experience it will continue to allow us to live among a beautiful diversity of animals, not just birds. Now, to conclude, I just want to point out that this isn't just an urban issue. Light pollution, the mysteries of nocturnal bird migration, etc. This is a global thing, and it connects to our diurnal or daytime experience as well. I am fascinated, to put it lightly, by this sort of yin-yang of this beautiful increase in our understanding of the science of nocturnal bird migration, while the landscapes below where birds are flying are disappearing faster than ever. It seems like an awfully cruel paradox. Habitat loss is a major issue for birds, and birding has taught me much more about habitat, appropriate habitat, and also about spaces that I might have formerly perceived as empty. For example, the open grasslands of California's foothills, which are home to the LeConte's thrasher, or the marshy shores of Texas, host to dozens of exhausted arriving warbler species who've just managed to make their way over the Gulf of Mexico. These spaces, while quote unquote empty to us, are home year after year to hundreds of species and millions of individual birds. And these birds provide a living thread between these landscapes' historic past and our living present. Here in New York City, for example, these connect us on the island of Manhattan to the true island of Mannahatta as it existed for thousands of years. Birding has also really changed the way I look at the world. If you all are birders, you probably can relate to this. As an illustrator, I've always looked at the world pretty closely. It helps ground me. It helps calm me down to sit and sketch the things that I'm seeing. But what I've learned in watching birders bird and drawing birders bird is not just about how the birds behave, but also about the people who love birds and how they behave. the wonderful quirk of human spirit, from adventure to curiosity, competition. There's a lot of that, as well as collaboration. On the left is a drawing I made after the Kirtland's warbler showed up in Central Park a couple years ago. This was like a bajillion strangers coming together to see one of the smallest possible birds you could look at. And nothing could put on paper how joyful that experience was. And on the right is the sketch I made of a friend of mine after they spotted a woodcock at the base of an oak tree, like 2 feet away from a woman checking her phone. Birding has also made me a really big advocate. I'm always out there trying to do good work as a citizen, but one of the things I really appreciate the most about learning about birding in this moment and in this century is that there are a lot of opportunities to get involved to help protect these incredible animals. I volunteer with Project Safe Flight through New York City Audubon, and I'm on the board of ABC, as was mentioned in the introduction. I've worked with the American Bird Conservancy since 2018. On the left, this QR code will take you to a slide set that helps advocate for bird safe glass that I created a couple of years ago so that folks could get involved if they wanted to. And I'm going to leave you with a resource list. This QR code takes you to, I think, every link I've provided so far, plus every book I've ever read, as well as a few other helpful websites. And just as a closing thought, I should mention 2 things. One is heartfelt thanks both to you all for listening and the Linnaean Society for encouraging people like me to continue to dig deeper into science and topics like this one. But also to everyone you just saw drawed. All of these illustrated figures are real life people who've helped me out along the way. And it's been a really wonderful adventure to learn more about birds. And then, as I mentioned, the people who advocate, study, et cetera, for them. I also wanted to make sure to mention why this is called 1001 Nights. You might be familiar with the story. As a quick refresher, it's about a sultan who takes a new bride every night and then the next morning kills her, which is absolutely unacceptable in every possible way and probably a story that shouldn't be told anymore. But one of the things that's fantastic about it is that there is a woman, Scheherazade, whose sister gets taken into this horrible scheme. And as a way of staying the executioner's knife, she asks the sultan if she can instead tell him a story a night, and that will allow her sister to live. And I think about this setup a lot as a narrative in the sense that I started my curiosity about nocturnal bird migration through the Tribune and Light. And it was sort of like pulling a thread that then unraveled, the whole sweater. And over the course of over 1001 nights at this point, 3+ years, I have found new stories every night and honestly every day that have kept me more and more interested in this topic. So I hope in telling you just a couple snippets of these stories, it will also intrigue you enough that you will consider advocacy, starting right here with the American Bird Conservancy and locally with New York City Audubon to help protect these incredible animals so that we can continue to stay the executioner's blade, as it were, and make sure that we don't lose any more species or landscapes while we have them. And that is all I wanted to say, although there's so much more. Thank you for having me, Gabriel.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Annie. That was amazing. You're a woman of too many talents. You're an amazing speaker and artist and thinker and
tell me more.
Yes. So no, it's an honor. And one of my primary duty as vice president of Linnaean Society of New York is to find speakers, really. And you were probably literally the first person I thought of. So
thanks, Gabriel.
I'm glad this finally happened. There was some, pandemic related snafus in there. So yeah, that was beautiful. Mostly the comments so far. So you and I met many years ago. How long ago do you think you and I met? At least 15 years ago, I'd say.
At least 15 years, yeah.
Through our mutual friend B.
Yes.
She was a fellow urban farmer, and I think you guys had a meeting. She was my roommate, and I think you guys had a meeting at my apartment. Was a farmer, urban farmer meeting, and I was just the roommate guy. But it turns out we had a lot to talk about. But Yeah, so not only, I mean, I guess this was probably mentioned in the intro, but not only do you run an entire program at the New York Botanical Garden, but you also have like the largest, if I'm not mistaken, commercial rooftop farm in America. At least it was for a while. Is that still the case?
First, but not largest.
Okay, first,
Yeah, and I
Eagle Street
didn't, I sort
Rooftop
of
Farm.
skipped what I usually contextualize my experience with the Tribute and Light by saying that the reason I know about the Tribute and Light is that one of the rooftop gardens I take care of is directly next to it. And I was on that rooftop looking down at the Tribute one year, many years ago, and saw movement in the beams. And I thought it was bats because I don't know anything else that moves at night, right? So I asked the fellow who owns that building, why are all these bats in this light? And he said, no, those are birds. And that was sea change. Like you have these lucky moments in life where you're like, everything I'm doing is changing now. And I am the person I am today because of that exact moment.
Okay, so I think that answered my question before I even asked it. The question was going to be, given that you have this urban farming and gardening background, yeah, how did you suddenly develop this interest in birds and nocturnal migration? So it was because you had another rooftop farm you were managing in the vicinity of Tribute and Light?
Directly
Were
above
you a
it.
bird watcher before that?
Not as actively as I am now. I think what I would say though is that, and this is, I hope, true for most of the folks listening in, is that the connection between plants and birds and landscapes and birds is a very, very natural one. And this is something I really admire about organizations like the American Bird Conservancy, is that is inexorably linked. So for me, as a person who loved plants and landscapes, it was a very natural second step to become more interested in birds. And what I really like about ABC, American Bird Conservancy, is that they are primarily focused on land acquisition and protection as a way of supporting bird species, while also remaining like deeply, intensely, perfectly nerdy about knowing everything about birds as well. So it's not just casual land acquisition, it's like targeted, specific, perfect. So I'm just taking a minute to soapbox about them because the work I do is very, very small. The rooftop gardens that I run are primarily agricultural, which mixed bag, if that's great for birds. Although we do our best by incorporating, habitat that's appropriate for birds in and among our crop landscape. But yeah, the larger scale work is being done by groups like ABC.
What was the rooftop farm or garden or plant situation that you were taking care of when you noticed the Tribute and Lights?
So it's called the Battery Rooftop Garden, and it's a private home, but if you Google it, Battery Rooftop Garden, you can see the gentleman who owns it is a phenomenal plants person. And that little garden has over 160 species of plants on it. We've done, not we, royal we, I have had nothing to do with really cool insect collections that have developed of, that also is a number upwards of 100 different species that have been collected there. And we get, anything that the Battery is getting, that park landscape, will also appear on the roof. And one thing I should point out about that is the roof itself is 35 stories up in the air, which is high, but not like New York City high. And one thing I've been very curious about as I've dug more and more into aeroecology, this sort of landscape space between the earth and the boundary layer of the atmosphere, is how truly high this life goes. So birds, for example, I mentioned that they sort of are aloft between 10 o'clock at night and maybe, pre-dawn, like 4 a.m. A lot of these birds are moving 3,000 meters up in the air. I mean, it's bizarre. You know this, but maybe not everyone listening in knows, like for a small bird that weighs as much as 2 quarters and a nickel to move their way hundreds of feet into the air. They're doing it, to get more smooth laminar flow. It's just much easier to move further off the surface of the earth where things are more turbulent because of temperature fluctuations. But I'm often struck as I'm 35 stories up in the air and then looking at something like the Tribute and Light where birds are moving. I said that, the beams are 4 miles high. You see birds moving all the way up at the top. It's remarkable. And this is why at the beginning I talked about Rachel Carson. The ocean was perceived as this just vast, deep emptiness. And that's how people think about the sky. And it's not. It's a rich, rich area of the world.
So yeah, I always think about that when I see chimney swifts, because sometimes they're hundreds, if not, 1,000. It's hard to judge height when you're looking, but maybe 1,000 feet. I don't know. Well, probably more. right? Because like
Easily more. Yeah.
easily more, right? Because you can see the top of One World Trade, and that's 1,700 plus. So yeah, a couple thousand feet, and they're catching bugs up there. And so it's not so much amazing to me that there's a bird at 2,000 feet, but it's amazing to me that there's little tiny spiders like floating on parachutes of
A
silk.
whole
And they
ecosystem.
call it aerial plankton, which I love. And so the chimney swifts are like little tiny aerial whales eating the aerial plankton. Like little, they really remind me of Pac-Man, the way it's like no, 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 up there.
Totally.
But I mean, plus when people no one asked this question, and I haven't even read anybody's questions yet. I'm just talking now. But when they did the studies on the European swifts with the little accelerometers from smartphones and discovered, they were like, we want to find out how long it takes them to get to Africa. And then they found out something else entirely, which was that they just don't land for 10 months. Like 24 hours a day, the European swifts just fly for 10 months. That's
like closing off half their brain so they can sleep, and then closing off the other half so they can sleep. Yeah.
And how that could even be the most like calorically efficient way to just fly for 10 months. Anyway, I digress. Let me check the questions. Okay. Well, this is very topical, based on the laminar flow you were just talking about. Air currents vary depending on altitude. Would you please speak to that? As dark skies, for example, you are only seeing surface winds. I assume it means dark skies, the app. Yeah, a little bit more about different altitudinal airflow, I think is the question.
Look, I mean, I'm not going to pretend to be a meteorological expert, although I do have 2 textbooks in my car that make me think I am. But I guess, let me think about how to answer this. A lot of, you have to remember too, that a bird's experience starts on the ground. So it's not like they're like flying up 10,000 feet, checking, and then coming back and being like, yep, it's good up there. They're taking off because they're experiencing what we're experiencing as well. So if you're seeing like I showed in that image, a southeasterly wind, birds on the ground are hype, and they're going to take off and leverage that. I think there's probably graphs that show this in Paul Kerlinger's book, Why Birds Migrate, or How Birds Migrate, which is on that book list I shared. But it sort of shows between that 10 o'clock and 3 o'clock period, like how long it takes them to get up to that peak height. And for a lot of it, they're in the same space that we are for, the beginning and the end.
Okay. And here's so I think it's interesting how technology has developed over the years, and how it used to be really you would sort of track birds if they had little, U.S. Fish and Wildlife bands, or back in Audubon's day, you mentioned the Phoebe with the silver thread. Yeah. And then now we've got things like these accelerometers and these increasingly small GPS devices. But one interesting intermediate stage is the MODIS wildlife tracking system, where you have these towers that pick up migrating birds. So Ben was wondering, do you know what's happening with that system in the NYC area? Apparently there's 2. There's one at Jamaica Bay and one at Coney Island. Yeah. Do you know anything about that?
I'm glad you mentioned that, Ben. Thank you. I'm not any more up to date than anyone else on what's happening in the New York City area. My last overlap with MODIS was when I was down in the Boulevard Peninsula of Texas, and there were a couple stations that were there that the local Houston Audubon folks were pretty psyched about. But no, and I think that's basically the best we could do, Gabriel, is mention that it's something called MODIS, MOTUS, and it's a phenomenal tracking system. And the more stations, the better. I want to point out too that it's not just tracking for the sake of tracking that's so exciting. It's, the more articulate we are in our understanding of these particular bird movements on an individual level, because that's how MODIS works. It's like a bird with its tracking device. The better we can be at targeting conservation efforts, everything from turning off wind turbines to making sure that certain habitats are preserved, to making sure that plants, are planted in the right spot. I think in the chat, David Haskell, hi David, it's really good to have you here, mentioned that the connection between plants and animals, particularly birds, is just locked in. I can't underscore that enough. So if something like MODIS excites you, or the geo-tracking systems I mentioned with Project Snowstorm, awesome. Like literally anything that helps us translate information back towards conservation is good.
Yeah. Just to elaborate a little bit for folks who aren't familiar, MODIS. So basically the challenge is miniaturization, like allowing birds to carry devices that track in real time or not. So like you can have something that's pretty tiny, like what the Swifts had, is accelerometers that you have to recover later. So they fly around for a year, you get them back at their nests, and that doesn't have to be as big as something that would be, say, transmitting in real time to a satellite or something. MODIS is kind of an intermediate stage where there's these towers, like cell phone towers, and if something flies past it, it will download the data from that device that the bird or whatever has. I guess you could have a bat or anything that's moving. I think maybe even marine mammals sometimes might be picked up by Motus. So yeah, so the device doesn't have to be as miniaturized as something, or rather, it can be pretty miniaturized. Excuse me. It would have to be bigger if it was transmitting to a satellite or something in real time. That's my understanding. Yeah. Of course, if you have a whale, it doesn't need to be miniaturized at all. They could carry a whole like backpack and it wouldn't.
Yeah.
But a bird needs something pretty small. And so it's interesting we have like more information about bigger birds than littler birds because they can carry devices that can transmit more information. Whereas like dragonfly migration is still kind of a mystery because we still haven't gotten small enough to stick things on dragonflies as far as I know. So it's kind of funny how those physical limitations play into this. This is not a question, but a comment, but I think it's worth mentioning. Frederica says, not a question. I want to mention that there's an active bill called the Dark Skies Protection Act pending before the New York Senate. It's S.7663 and New York Assembly A.8644. Please check it out. Contact your representative to support it to control outdoor light pollution. And I believe there's also, isn't there this is separate. I think there's a bird safe glass building before like Congress, like US Congress, right?
The American Bird Conservancy is doing an amazing job advocating for that.
There we go.
And New York City Audubon, all props to them for kind of kicking that off locally. We are really lucky that we have these organizations at work. I think one of the QR codes I showed, and also on that book list QR code, I can pull that up again if that's helpful, but was to the bill that was just mentioned. It was, if you go to New York City Audubon's page, they have a lights out page that talks about this particular legislation. Yeah, and we've talked a little bit about like different ways to get involved. I mentioned I'm a volunteer for Project Safe Light with New York City Audubon. I'm a board member for American Bird Conservancy, but legislation is really crucial. So if any of you are so inclined to call your legislators or to reach into other people's districts and call their legislators, this is made a pronounced and marked difference in the last couple of years for birds. So please be a citizen.
So that's the statewide lights out legislation, and there's federal bird safe glass legislation. So in New York City, we passed bird safe glass legislation about 2 years ago, thanks to the Project Safe Light, 20 years of advocacy and research from New York City Audubon. And then there was a lights out bill that was passed last year that originally was going to be like all buildings, and it was scaled back, unfortunately, to only be city buildings. Yeah. Which is still a lot. That's courts and prisons and I don't know, schools, and it's a bunch of things, but I don't think the city has that many like skyscrapers that are lit up and stuff. So it was definitely a lower scope than it would have been. But we're still advocating for a more comprehensive bill. So yeah, that's
and I'm remiss because I didn't mention this or show this in the presentation, but it's worth mentioning now that if you're not sure what bird safe glass is, abcbirds.org has a lot of information on it through Chris Shepard, who I quoted multiple times as like a bird safe glass genius. But the key things to remember is that birds are often striking the glass in the morning during their sort of orientation flight. So they'll land at night safely. It's not like they're like hitting glass in the middle of the night necessarily. But they will strike glass in the morning when they're seeing reflections of trees and landscapes and thinking they can just fly right through the glass. So what's most helpful is something that's on the outside, not the inside of the glass, but on the outside. And then typically you want to aim for 4 inches apart or less because birds are acutely aware of their wingspan. And so they will fly right through it if you put like a hawk decal on the window. That does literally nothing but make your window look dumb, sorry to say. So you want to aim for 4 inches or less of anything, dots, tape. Again, abcbirds.org has the products ranked, so you can consider options for your office, your home, etc.
Yeah, it's amazing how many like nature centers and like parks, buildings and stuff you still see with those falcon decals. Like, I don't think the birds register them as birds of prey, and also they aren't close enough, like you say, so they're actually kind of useless. So don't bother with that. String or dots, that's the way to go. Or if you want to go high end, like Ornolux glass that's made in Germany that has like a UV reflective pattern. Someone wants to know, this is great, David wants to know, do you have advice on when to go out and hear nocturnal flight calls?
My first experience with this, and thank you for that question, David, was going down to Cape May with Michael O'Brien, who's like one of North America's coolest nocturnal bird call guys. It was a very overcast night. There was like a low cloud cover. So birds, instead of, they'll lower their flight because the clouds are low. They don't want to fly through the clouds because clouds have a lot of turbulence and are cold and wet, like shockingly cold. put your hand on the window of an airplane one day when you're going through clouds and you'd be like, no, thank you. So you go on a low cloud cover night with favorable winds and then stand with your hands behind your ears and you'll hear the chip notes of different birds. So one of my favorite tools for this, I showed that image of the sort of illustrated versions of these calls at oldbirds.org. You can learn more about these, but it's a great way to memorize them. There's a new Peterson Field Guide that has like the bird, that illustration, and then a website that will tell you, that will play it for you. And it's great. Like, it's like, or like, or like, it
Is
depends
it a
on
field
the
guide
bird.
to chip calls or nocturnal flight calls? Or
Yeah,
something?
exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very cool. Okay, thank you. And Linnaean Society's own Chuck McAlexander wants to know, what causes a bird to migrate over water versus land? That's a cool question.
It's a good question. I regret that by nature of me trying to squeeze everything possible into one 45-minute session, I didn't do anything very deeply. So your question sort of targets the beginning question of this book project I'm working on, which is like, why are birds doing this thing and how are they making these choices? I think the direct answer, this is going to be very species specific. One would be, a lot of birds are moving over areas without large bodies of water. Like if you're flying over the Rockies, that's not like a principal concern. But if you're a coastal migrant and you're deciding if you want to fly down from the Adirondacks, sort of at a diagonal versus over the coast, for example, I think a lot of it ends up having to do with the wind conditions at night, your species preference at large. And then there are examples of birds, let's see, like brown pelican, which is a diurnal migrant that might actually choose not just to go over land versus water, in their case, water, but also the height that they fly over the water is kind of interesting to see. And that again has a lot to do with like what's easiest, what's least calorically intensive, what's smoothest, laminar flow, that kind of thing. So I'm going to give a very broad answer to a specific question, but it's because there are so many different species of birds and so many different places they move and choices they would make. You might find the best answer in that book I mentioned, How Birds Migrate by Paul Curlinger, which was loaned to me by Heather Wolf. So props, Heather. It's a great, concise, it will explain everything I tried to explain in 2 minutes at the beginning of the talk. How Birds Migrate, Curlinger.
I noticed it seems like more diurnal migrants migrate over land and nocturnal migrants seem to potentially, I don't know if that's, but like raptors go over land because they're using thermals, and thermals don't really occur over water in the same way. But then also blue jays are diurnal migrants, and they seem to hate going over water. They'll really avoid it if they can. It's fun watching. Right now, there's a ton of blue jays. People don't think of blue jays as a typical migrant, but we have resident blue jays, but there's a ton of blue jays migrating through right now. You can see hundreds and hundreds going. But I lead bird walks in the Battery. I'll be there tomorrow, 8 a.m., free drop-in walk if anybody wants to come. And you'll just see blue jays coming down, and then they do not want to cross the harbor or the Hudson. They just start piling up in the Battery and like screaming and kind of looking around and they're like, So that's interesting. I don't know if that's about being caught out over the water with predators or if it's about currents of the air. Or, I don't know.
I think all of those points are correct, but I again, like I think the atmosphere thing is a big part of it. We don't think about this a lot because our lives don't, we'll notice if it's a windy day, but we're not like profoundly impacted like we used to be or like most animals are. And you see this behavior at Cape May too, right? Like part of why Cape May or Falsterbo, Sweden, or the Manamet Bird Observatory on Cape Cod, part of what makes these places such successful bird observation stations and bird banding stations is that they're next to water that causes birds to pause and to funnel, just like you just described with blue jays. So this isn't exactly answering the question that was asked, but it is a cool thing about birds making choices to go out over water or not is they're very aware they're about to hop and do something dangerous. And where I see this a lot in a really fascinating way is birds that do the jump over the Gulf of Mexico. There are, I'm not going to remember the species off the top of my head, but the difference between flying from Central America to Texas over the Gulf versus flying back over land. It's not blackpoll warbler, so that's another cool one that does like a funny loop. But even in their migration paths, they're not necessarily backtracking. They might choose like two different ways to go, particularly because of seasonally dominant winds and how that might help them get over the Gulf, but not help them get back, for example.
Well, it's like how here in New York, you never have spring Connecticut warblers, but you do have fall Connecticut warblers because they take the Atlantic flyway in the fall southbound, but the central flyway northbound. And there's, I guess, a few birds where that's the case, but Connecticut warbler immediately comes to mind because like a spring Connecticut warbler on the East Coast is unheard of. Yeah, but yeah, that's why Cape May is so amazing, because it's basically is shaped like a funnel. And that's why it's amazing in the fall, but just sort of like regular in the spring, because they're getting funneled down with water on either side, Delaware Bay, Atlantic, and then they're all piling up at the tip, like, again, not wanting. And the big thing there is the morning flight, but it's often a reverse flight where they're coming back off the water because they changed their mind.
Yeah.
Right. And the spring, they don't really find Cape May. They're going up the mainland more. Yeah. Here's a cool question. We're talking about predation. Do night lights, nocturnal lights, attract predatory birds that in turn attack migrating birds?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that is seen at the Tribune Light every year. You'll see raptors come in and pick off both birds and insects once they see that the birds are entrained. I'm going to keep my answers shorter moving forward. Sorry.
No, that's good. I think we have one more question. We'll take one more question, actually. But yeah, I find that fascinating. You see that at the Empire State Building too. You'll see peregrine falcons circling around, picking off migrants, and it just shows how adaptable they are, that they're seeking these bright lights and taking advantage of that, which is pretty cool. So Richard says, beautiful and fascinating presentation. By the way, I skipped a bunch of those. People saying, thank you, wonderful, wonderful presentation. This was so great. How can we hear more of your talks? Beautiful, etc. But beautiful, fascinating presentation. Question about the migration routes. They were listening to the ABA podcast about a recently released migration app, and they seem to imply that the various migration routes are not set in stone for various species. I don't know if it's sort of phrased more as a statement, but I guess the question is, yeah, what kind of plasticity is there for different species in the route?
I don't know. I mean, this is something, it sounds like we're all sort of figuring this out. I do know that, so primarily what I've looked at over the course of working on this project is our understanding of these paths and how wrong we've been to how we think we're right now. Species to species, the ABA is going to know a lot more about how pathways are plastic. But what I could say broadly, again, just coming from a perspective of being a land conservationist at heart, is I mean, birds as individuals and through generations have to make choices to change where they move. It's habitat shifting below them. So I'm not sure if what you're pointing to, Richard, is something that the ABA or this app released about like large scale shifts, like we were over the Mississippi Delta and now we're like not doing that anymore, or just something more nuanced. But I would say that yeah, I mean, in a way, I want to say, I hope that birds can do that successfully, because that's going to be to the advantage of their species survival, right? To be able to move around spaces that no longer work for them. So it's almost like a pessimistic answer, but I'm curious now, Richard, thank you for the suggestion to look this up, because it sounds like it will add a lot to what I'm working on.
Well, no pressure now, but I'm curious. I remember when I was programming art installations at the New York City Audubon Governor's Island House, you had a show that was related to your book, and you even drew on the walls. And what's the timeline for this book? No pressure, for the book actually being published. Do you know that at this point? So
yeah, it's a great question. My editor asked me the same question this morning when I emailed her the link to this lecture. Well, I'll tell you all, since we're all friends now and have seen the drawings. One of the prohibiting factors to getting this project, in the last stage of completion, is that, well, two things. One is, so I'm really interested in storytelling. I hope that came through. And I am curious, maybe this could be an audience poll, on the merits of fiction versus nonfiction in relaying this particular narrative. So I've, drummed this book up in both directions. One has been more like Paul Kerlinger's How Birds Migrate book, where it's what you just saw and the information you just saw. And then another version is really thinking about this as a story, like who would move through this landscape and tell you all of this information. So that's my private journey to figure out. The other piece is, with digital illustration, in case you're interested, nerds out there, the tools we use to do it are changing quite a lot as well. And so I've actually moved through, I think, 4 or 5 different iterations at this point of like literal tools to make these drawings, which is fun. Like, I think that's part of why I like making this project, is getting to fuss around with art. But yeah, so, all that to say, what's the timeline? I think the sooner the better, because the reality is when I first started thinking about this stuff, it was, I think, 2015. So it's been a few years. It's been over 1,001 nights at this point. And I've noticed 2 things. One is that the technology has only gotten more I was going to say kick-ass. Is that appropriate? The
Sure.
fact that birdcast like appeared during my research is kind of incredible. And the detriment to bird, the conservation need has only gotten greater. 3billionbirds.org was launched while I was writing this project. So it always feels pressing, you know. So I don't actually have an answer, I'm sorry to say, but at least now you can see why I don't.
Yeah.
Soon.
Wow.
Within 5
So when you
years.
say digital illustration tools, okay, last question. Yeah, I didn't even ask about like your art background and how you managed to take that on. So are you producing these drawings on like an iPad or something like that?
Yeah, so I'll point out first of all 2 things. One is my mother is a very talented artist, and the reason I can do any of this is that she raised us in a house with like cabinets of art materials. So I feel very lucky in that way. And I'll also, as the second thing, mention that you, Gabriel, are a fantastic artist, like incredible. So I'm very excited to be talking about illustration with you. We should have done that the whole time. But yeah, I'm using a tablet, and it's not super satisfying. I love drawing on paper, but digital work has been a lot better for this particular project because it's allowing me to stay consistent in the work that I produce. I find that when I do hand drawings, it's hard to cleanly render them in a way that's consistent. Part of that just has to do with my life. I have multiple full-time jobs, and if I'm producing art slowly, my skill set changes as I work on it. So if I'm working on a project for 7 years, the beginning of the book would look different from the end if I did it by hand. One thing I'll mention, to be slightly self-indulgent, you may have picked up in the arc of the slides that it goes from black and white to color. And that's something I'm very interested in this story. It didn't start in black and white just because it was the tribute in light. I actually really like the idea that as the book progresses through our understanding of these spaces and moves from technology to actual landscapes, you come into the light, as it were. And I mentioned briefly that one of the things I'm struggling with is how to depict a bird's eye view of the world in a real way. Like how do you take a world dominated by peripheral vision and put that on a 2-dimensional piece of paper? So I think if I can crack that nut, I will submit a book proposal to Kelly Snowden, my editor. And I hope that comes over the winter when I have weekends again and I'm not working so much in the garden.
Maybe that'll be another technological leap. Maybe your book will actually have to be released via a VR headset when like Apple comes out with their VR headset or something. So it'll actually encompass the peripheral vision, and a book won't actually be the format. I'll give Laura the last word. She says, your storytelling is so lyrical. What about telling a story from the perspective of the bird themselves, or maybe a memoir, a combo of fiction and nonfiction? Don't let them put you in a box, says Laura. And I don't know if the memoir means the memoir of a migrating bird or your memoir. I think both would be equally fascinating because there's so many things we didn't even touch on. You're a marathon runner. You do so many things, gardening, farming, illustrator. So yes, I think everybody would love to hear more about your work and the creative projects you have going on. If anybody does want to find out more about you, Annie, what's the best way for them to do that? And then we'll wrap it up.
Sure. So the best thing, I think AnnieNovak.com has it all for you. It's Novak, like the actress Kim Novak. And Diane Palladino, who's one of my multiple students, hello Diane, asked about, she took my tree course, and so I teach, hopefully that's clear. I hope I'm a fairly good communicator and educator, but I teach a lot of classes primarily in the plant sphere. I have a class coming up starting in December called How to Read a Landscape, Botany and Ecology, and it teaches you in a couple of sessions to go into any landscape at all and derive from it every possible piece of information you could, both from a hard botanical perspective as well as just an experiential one. So if you liked the journey we took tonight, you might like that class. And I teach, online all over the place. So that's AnnieNovak.com, and then my Instagram, I think it's just Annie Novak _ is probably the best place to catch up.
Amazing. Well, yeah, Annie, this was incredible. Thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, I think you need a few more projects, though. You're not really keeping busy enough. So thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight at the Illuminating Society of New York's October meeting and lecture. We'll be back in a month's time, the second Tuesday in November, when Roger Pasquier will be talking about winter survival. I believe somewhat specific to birds, possibly. So tune in for that. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you so much, Annie, for joining us. This was fantastic. And I look forward to seeing everybody next month.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Have a great night.